Prince Edward Island has the lowest population of any province in Canada, just over 160,000 people. And so, when the provincial government implemented a new program designed to address labor shortages and bring in entrepreneurs, it seemed like a great idea. Soon, PEI was welcoming the most immigrants per capita of any province. The other thing they were doing more than any other province was struggling to retain those immigrants. Eventually, an investigation would lead to several homes and a motel that were listed as the address for hundreds of immigrants who definitely did not live there. But that was just the latest scandal in a 2-decade-long saga of a broken immigration system that allowed the richest to buy their way to Canada and the government to make millions off it. The Provincial Nominee Program, or PNP, is not something exclusive to PEI. Every province in Canada except Quebec has adopted some version of the program. PNPs have expanded to be some of the largest individual immigration initiatives in the country, welcoming 68,000 people in 2019. When it comes to filling labor shortages, PEI's program worked more or less like the rest of the country. Where things differed was in the entrepreneurship stream. Potential immigrants had to pay the province a conditional $200,000 deposit. That deposit was fully refundable if the immigrant demonstrated after 2 years that they had either purchased 100% ownership of a business or started a new business that was running in PEI and that they lived on the island. In exchange, immigrants were granted immediate permanent residency in Canada, something that, especially in recent years, has been highly sought after and difficult to obtain. PEI started to attract a large number of immigrants who were theoretically coming to set up new businesses, something that would be a boon for one of the poorest provinces in the country. But in reality, that's not what was happening, at least not with everyone. The PNP became a pipeline, not for creating jobs and new businesses, but for wealthy immigrants to purchase PR status. Rather than go through the trouble of starting a business in a small province like PEI, many were choosing to forfeit their deposit and then head somewhere else. In November of 2017, a year before the program closed, the government said they had not returned $18 million in deposits to 177 immigrants, the majority of whom had never even attempted to open a business. Over the life of the program, more immigrants forfeit their deposits than were refunded. Legally, there was technically nothing wrong with this. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees mobility. It would have been against the charter to force new immigrants to stay in the province. Beyond having no legal recourse, PEI had very little idea of where the immigrants accepted by the program actually were. Many accepted applicants never came to the immigration office for intake, despite it being a requirement, so the province had no contact information for them. In 2017, a study found that only 41% of immigrants who landed in PEI 5 years ago still lived in the province. In May of 2018, Ping Zhang and her brother Yi were charged with aiding and abetting misrepresentation under the Federal Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. The Zhangs had been allowing immigrants who had left the province to use their home address and the address of the Sherwood Motel, which they owned, to falsely claim they were still living in PEI, as they were required to in order to get their deposit back. A second probe alleged that 2 other Chinese immigrants had allowed others accepted by the PNP to use their address as addresses of convenience to pretend they lived in PEI. Their immigration documents would then be collected and forwarded on to them at their real Canadian address or back in China. Between the 2 cases, the total number of addresses of convenience is about 1,000. with almost all of those people receiving permanent residency in Canada. The charges against the Zhangs were dropped. Although some immigrants had certainly taken advantage of them to use their address to commit fraud, the Zhangs were naively trying to help, and the Crown couldn't make a case against them. Charges have never been brought against the other 2 Chinese immigrants. Despite the failings of the program, there was an upside for the province. All of those defaulted deposits ended up in the provincial coffers, bringing in millions of dollars over the years the program was operating and beyond. In 2022, 4 years after the program ended, the government still made $8.9 million off of defaulted deposits, due to their inefficient bureaucracy that was only then getting to some cases from 4 years prior. Yet overall, the provincial economy and the government itself would have benefited much more from an additional several hundred entrepreneurs staying and working in the province. This scandal points at terrible results for a program designed to attract business owners. Yet this is the second iteration of a program like this in PEI, and believe it or not, a far less problematic one than its predecessor. In 2001, PEI began a different entrepreneurial immigration program, one whose basic tenets were even more obviously exploitable. That program stipulated that potential immigrants invest about $200,000 in a business on the island. Immigrants had no part in choosing the business and were not involved in the business in any way. Some immigrants reported coming to PEI and not even knowing the name of the business that they now owned part of. Immigrants then needed to live on the island for a year to obtain their PR. Federal requirements changed in 2002 to require that immigrants have an active role in the business they invested in, giving them a tangible reason to stay in the place that nominated them. PEI found a way around this by determining that sitting on the board of directors constituted an active role. And so, many immigrants were added to the boards of companies across the province and were issued preferred shares, although savvy financial agreements prevented the immigrants from cashing out or being paid dividends on those shares in most cases. Those boards of director roles were almost always on paper only and didn't require any actual involvement from the immigrants. One of the goals of the program was to bring in huge amounts of money to businesses on the island. And it did that. Several businesses were only able to survive because of money they received from the program. Based on how the program was advertised, it should have brought in around $660 million to businesses in PEI. That's twice the annual value of the island's agriculture sector. Functionally, it didn't work out that way. Nearly half of that money went to middlemen, who helped match potential immigrants to businesses they could invest in. After agent, government, and middleman fees, many businesses only received about $50,000 or less of the $200,000 investment immigrants were supposedly making. Beverly McQuillan is one of the people who helped create the program. She soon went on to found a company called PEI Equity Alliance, a firm that served as an intermediary between immigrants and businesses in PEI. Between 2006 to 2009, PEI Equity Alliance took in about $10 million in PNP money that they sent through a series of wire transfers to a shell company in Hong Kong. In 2002, the CRA found that Equity Alliance owed more than $3 million in unpaid taxes. In other cases, organizations in PEI created fake companies so they could get money, because their business was not eligible for funding. The Confederation Center for the Arts, a nonprofit, created 2 shell companies to receive money, since nonprofits were ineligible for funding. The CEO of the Confederation Center, David McKenzie, was later appointed Deputy Minister of Tourism and Culture. I'm not saying there's a direct connection there, but it's yet another well-connected individual receiving funding under the program. The result for many immigrants is that they had no choice but to leave PEI. Instead of being invested in a business for which they could receive dividends, have roles in decision-making, or be otherwise involved, they were given a title with value only on paper. Beverly McQuillan herself is quoted as saying that her clients were discouraged from being involved because their English was not very good. As a result, they had to make it on their own in PEI, a province with very few job prospects where they were isolated from any kind of cultural identity. Most moved on to cities like Toronto or Vancouver. Some were discouraged by what they saw in Canada and returned to their home country. Of PNP nominees, only 45% of those nominated in PEI reported employment income in their first year. In comparison to almost all of the nominees in Alberta, PEI nominees averaged $20,000 a year in income versus $80,000 in Alberta. In 2008, the federal government gave direction to scrap the program, and in response, the province rushed through 2,000 final applications, bringing in about $400 million to the province. 3 women who worked for the PNP at the time came forward, alleging that funds from the program were being poured into businesses owned by government officials and their families, and certain government officials were accepting bribes to fast-track applications. An RCMP investigation took place, but they eventually decided not to lay any charges. 2 former deputy ministers, Peter McQuaid and Brooke McMillan, received funds for their businesses from the PNP while in office. After the scandal broke, they were asked by the Premier to return the funds and agreed. Of those cases, the case of Brooke McMillan is the most suspicious. McMillan oversaw the Immigrant Investor Program when it was closed on July 31, 2008. A few days later, on August 5th, McMillan accepted a new role as the head of the Liquor Control Commission, That same day, the application process for the investor program reopened for 2 days, allegedly for administrative reasons. During those 2 days, the government approved 55 applications, including businesses connected to Macmillan and his wife, for investments totaling around $250,000. But even now, 16 years later, what actually happened and to what level government officials benefited is still unknown. The Provincial Auditor General Colin Yonker found the program had long lacked proper oversight and identified conflicts of interest in senior officials across a few administrations, but was prevented from revealing that information by a government-led committee that claimed that a conflict of interest investigation had cleared any government official whose business had received funds. It took several years, but eventually the Supreme Court ordered the PEI government to release the list of businesses who had received funds from the program. Even then, that list did not include how much money each business received, and still prompted more questions. Regardless of to what degree the well-connected received money from the program, in the end, it didn't work very well either. By some estimates, about 3/4 of the immigrants who came to PEI through that version of the PNP had left within 3 years. PEI has changed its entrepreneurial stream once again, this time trying to entice immigrants who have partnerships or investments from angel investors, incubators, or venture capital firms. New immigrants will have to live and work in PEI on a visa before receiving their permanent residency, as the province hopes to attract entrepreneurs who might actually stay on the island this time. At the same time, the province is struggling with a different stream of immigration, as they recently announced they were reducing permanent residency nominations for temporary workers by 25%. Many immigrants, particularly from India, took part in a hunger strike to protest the changes. And they have a point. Many of those involved in the protest came to PEI with an explicit path towards PR, and have had that taken away from them. Now, many of them, instead of working towards their permanent residency, will have their work permit expire in a few months and face deportation. The comparison of these two sets of immigrants puts into stark relief the value that we place on a person. Since 2001, PEI has tried and failed to bring wealthy immigrants to the province, even in the face of consistent evidence that their programs were resulting in almost none of the immigrants they targeted actually staying and working on the island. Now, they're set to try again, with a third iteration of a program that's never worked and has been constantly marred by scandal, in the hopes the wealthy will come and stay. And on the other hand, workers who have made PEI their home, who have filled in labor shortages and low-paying, underappreciated jobs, who have hoped to raise their family on the island will likely face deportation, despite being promised something else when they came here. All because they aren't worth enough to the government of Prince Edward Island.